Everyone, my name is John DeBella, Vice President of Marketing and Sales, and on behalf of Simulations Plus, I welcome you to today's webinar, which will focus on our newest simulation program, MembranePlus. Dr. Viera Lukacova, Team Leader, Simulation Technologies at Simulations Plus, will be presenting today. Joining Viera as a panelist is Mr. Jim Mullen, Product Manager for MembranePlus. An opportunity to ask questions will follow Viera's presentation. You may either send your question using the questions pane on your control panel, or you may ask your question directly using the hand-raising icon. If you're using a telephone to listen to the call, please be sure to enter the unique audio PIN displayed when you joined. When you enter your audio PIN, this enables us to unmute your line so that you can be heard. This webinar is being recorded for playback at our website, www.simulations-plus.com. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Viera. Viera?
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this presentation. And let us give you a brief introduction or overview of our MembranePlus software. Some of you have heard about us talking about this software for quite some time now, and now we have finally made it into a product that you all will be able to try if you are interested. MembranePlus is really focused on in vitro permeability assays. And in these initial stages, it will be probably more of a data analysis tool helping you figure out what is happening with the compound in your in vitro permeability assays, maybe trying to deconvolute some of the parameters like in vitro Km, Vmax values, especially the in vitro Km values for efflux transporters, may be valuable outputs for in vivo simulations. But also getting information on where the drug is getting distributed into the cells, looking at the membrane, intracellular concentrations, trapping in the lysosomes, and so on. Also allowing you to do some sensitivity analysis and exploring how maybe the experimental conditions or drug properties may be affecting the permeability that you are measuring. The goal is moving this more and more towards predictive software so that you would be able to start doing predictions on the permeabilities as well as predicting more gaining more confidence in predicting the intracellular unbound concentrations again, especially for the translations to in vivo experiments. Some of the future developments that we have planned are for extending the capabilities for DDI predictions, so start incorporating analysis with respect to inhibitors, especially for the inhibitors of the transporters, influx, efflux transporters, and also incorporating virtual trials or the accounting for the variability in the predictions or in the measurements. The systems and mechanisms that we have incorporated at the moment, as when it comes to the systems, it is really focused at the moment on cell monolayer based in vitro systems. So currently we have not incorporated yet sandwich cultured hepatocytes or suspended hepatocytes or looking at the tissue slices. Those are all possible future developments that we may be incorporating in a near future, but for the moment it is really focused on looking at your analysis or looking at your assays done in either PAMPA, KEICO2, MDCK, or any other cell monolayer systems. I know that there is probably a lot of those that you may be using, some other systems, LLC-PKs, and so on. And we have built in some basic parameters for these assays being set up in different types of plates, 12, 24, 96 wells, plates, so you do have already built-in variety of different conditions helping with the calibrating your own system. As for the processes that we are incorporating, the processes that are that the drug undergoes within these permeability assays, we really try to incorporate all of the most important or specific processes that may be affecting the drug permeability or drug distribution in this whole system. Perhaps better this will be discussed on the graphics. So if we look at the drug moving from the apical, the graphics here is going in the direction from apical to basolateral side, but of course the same would apply in the reverse direction. So we have a diffusion of the drug through the media in the dosing compartment, followed by the drug getting through the cells. And here, of course, we are accounting for the passive diffusion through the cell membrane. So we have models accounting for the drug entering and exiting the cell membrane. And you have also an option to incorporate the transporters, uptake or efflux transporters on the apical side. The drug that makes it inside the cell, we are accounting for possible trapping in the lysosomes. This is a topic that has been discussed a lot recently, especially in the with respect to drug distribution and lysosomal trapping. So again, it's a process that you are able to explore a little bit better with this software. We have an option to account for possible metabolism of the drug inside the cells. Depending on what kind of cell system you are using, you may have metabolism by some of the enzymes, so you can account for that process as well. Of course, the drug needs to exit on the other side of the cell, so again we have the diffusion through the membranes or the effect of transporters, again getting the drug to the other side, or influx efflux transporters on the basolateral side. In addition to drug crossing the membrane through the cells and possibly being subjected to all of these mechanisms, it can also proceed via paracellular pathway in between the cells. So this is incorporated as a process that you can account for, and additional process accounting for the filter permeability. Again, as the drug gets either through the cells or between the cells on the basolateral side, it faces one more possible barrier, and that is going through the filter or going through the pores of the filter. And of course, we have then diffusion through the unstirred water layer on the basolateral side and getting into the bulk solution. In addition to these basic processes, we are accounting for possible protein binding in the apical or basolateral media if you are running assay with adding albumin or protein into your media, maybe to prevent excessive binding to the to the plates, or keep drug a little bit more in solution, or maybe accounting for more physiological conditions, trying to have protein binding on the basolateral side. These processes are accounted for in the system as well. And speaking of binding to plastic, we do have also additional processes to account for this kind of non-specific loss of the compound from the system, either by binding to plastic or any other losses that would be affecting your measured permeability or measured concentrations on apical and basolateral side that you can account for. And we also account for possible evaporation of the compound from the apical side. So let's look a little bit more closely at some of these processes to give you a better overview, better feel for what is going on in the background or how we are dealing with these individual processes. Starting with the diffusion of the drug through the apical and basolateral media. And here, of course, the basic parameter for the compound would be a diffusion coefficient. But the important aspect is determining the thickness of the unstirred water layer. And for this, we have taken published equations. Nielsen back in 2004 published a nice summary of several different models relating this unstable water layer thickness to the stirring or shaking rate. And based on this, we selected one of these equations to be used within the program. So as you are entering the shaking rate for your experiment, the program automatically calculates this unstable water layer or diffusion layer thickness to be used as a additional barrier to the permeability of the compound. Once the drug makes it through the unstable water layer, we have the passive diffusion through the membrane on both apical and basolateral side. And for this, we actually have several different ways of accounting for the drug getting into the membrane and getting out of the membrane. The default model is a structure-based model which was trained on 44 Keiko-2 experiments which were provided to us by absorption systems. These were experiments for 22 compounds measured in apical to basolateral and basolateral to apical direction. And the main properties of the compound that determine the rate of permeation or entry or exit into the rates, entry rates and exit rates from the membrane are, as you would expect, the log P, but also the hydrogen bonding features of the compound are the important factors. And this is showing the performance of the model. As you can see, the model is able to nicely reproduce the predicted the concentrations on the apical and basolateral side from all 44 experiments for those 22 compounds. Some of you may be familiar with the published model, which was published back in the 70s by Kubini, suggesting the relationship between the rates of entry and exit from the membrane dependent on the partition coefficient, could be octanol water, or in our case, it's a membrane water partition coefficient, which we are calculating from the octanol water partition coefficient. This model, as we have found through the exploration of the experimental data, is works very nicely for a congeneric series of compounds. So this model is still available in MembranePlus, and if you are working with a series of compounds where you don't have much differences in hydrogen bonding, basically looking at the same scaffold, maybe just changing some of the substituents that are not affecting hydrogen bonding or ring structures, you will be able to calibrate this model, which is dependent mainly on log P alone, and use that model also for your system. It really depends on the type of compound you are working with. But for us, trying to set up a default model which is more general, able to account for a variety of structures covering larger chemical space, the default model is the structure-based model, which is really able to account for wider variety of structures. And finally, you do have an option to enter these rates of drug entry and exit from the membrane as well. So that is an option. Of course, this is something that you would have to fit to your data. As it stands, we don't have any other way of predicting these directly other than using some of the drug properties described for these models above. Of course, it's not only about entry and exit rates of neutral molecules. We do account also for the entry and exit rates of charged molecules to the membrane. As you would all expect, the charged molecules will have much lower entry rates and possibly higher exit rates than the neutral molecules, and we are accounting for those as well. So these built-in models do include calculation of the entry and exit rates for the charged molecules as well. And as I mentioned, we do include both models. The original Kubini model, which is based only on log P, and as such is more suitable for a congeneric series of compounds or the internal model based also heavily on log P or log D, but includes some additional structural features, making it more suitable for a wider range of compounds or for wider chemical space. For paracellular passive diffusion or filter permeability, we are using the published equations. Again, these equations, you may know this equation heavily from accounting for paracellular permeability. The same equation accounting for the relationship between the size of your molecule and pore sizes, whether pore sizes of the filter or the pore sizes in the tight junctions between the cells, accounting for the porosity and length of the pores. We are calculating the permeability of either the filter or paracellular permeability. The same type of equation would apply. And the total effective paracellular permeability is then calculated by accounting for both the paracellular permeability as well as permeability of the filter. When it comes to the parameters for the filter itself, these are system-specific parameters accounting for the pore sizes, pore densities, and these are parameters that you would be able to get or that come from the specifications of from the manufacturer specifications for the inserts that you are using for your specific assay. For the paracellular permeability, we do include two types of models, especially when it comes to accounting for size of the molecule. For those of you who are familiar with GastroPlus, you know that we have two models incorporated. One is the adson model, which assumes the molecule, every molecule is a simple sphere, and the radius could be calculated simply from the molecular weight of the compound. The more detailed model is a Gemini model, which accounts also for shape of the molecule. So it accounts for differences between the spherical molecule or more ellipsoidal molecule, which may have the same molecular weight, but because of the different shape, it may fit to different sizes of the pores. So we really try to keep these models consistent between our various products. So the same types of paracellular models as you are used to from GastroPlus, you have available in MembranePlus as well. This would also make the results more easily translatable from one software to another. When it comes to physiological or system parameters to account for paracellular permeability, these again include the pore radius and porosity and the length of the pores and also potential electrical potential gradient, important especially for permeability of charged molecules. We did incorporate default parameters based on the data reported in literature, mainly based on the Adson's papers, but these are parameters that you really should be modifying based on your systems. As you know, depending on the culture conditions, type of the cells that you are using, time of the culture, that all of those could contribute to quite different conditions for the paracellular permeability in terms of the tight junctions, pore radii, porosities, and so on. So this is a set of physiological parameters that you should be calibrating for your own cell culture setup, and the way to calibrate them is running paracellular markers. And we do have a feature for calculating or back calculating the pore radius and porosity from mannitol very easily. If you have measured mannitol, you can enter the permeability into the program, and a simple double-click feature allows you to estimate that pore radius for your specific cell assay setup. If you incorporate also some of the charged paracellular markers, then you can use the full optimization model to fit all of these parameters and have the paracellular pathway calibrated for your specific cell assay, for your specific culture conditions and the assay setup. For transporters and possible metabolism inside of the cells, as you would expect, we are using the Michaelis-Menten kinetics, utilizing unbound concentrations, the relevant unbound concentrations, either unbound concentrations in buffer for the influx transporters, and utilizing the unbound intracellular concentrations for efflux transporters and for metabolism inside of the cells. The units are maybe a bit unusual. This is still, especially for the Vmax, this is still a consequence of some of the conversion factors or unknown characterization of the system itself. But we do provide a unit converter which allows you to convert the decay and Vmax units into the different types of units that makes it easier for, let's say, translating into GastroPlus. For those of you who know GastroPlus, you know Km value is required in milligrams per second. So we did incorporate this nice converter that allows you to output units in or these values in units that are more common or can be easily translated into different software. For lysosomal trapping, this may be one of the more interesting aspects of utilizing the software, trying to predict the drug's potential for getting trapped in the lysosomes. As you know, this is aspect, especially for basic compounds, which due to differential in pH in the cell cytosol and inside the lysosomes may cause the ionized drug getting trapped inside the lysosomes and affect not only the distribution of the compound but also the apparent measured permeability, slowing down the appearance of the compound in the receiver compartment. And again, we do provide basic system or physiological parameters accounting for the properties of the lysosomes, for the overall cell volume of the lysosomes inside the cells, pH, and so on. And for the diffusion through the cell, through the lysosomal membrane, we are using the same type of equations or the same rates of drug getting into the membrane and out of the membrane as we are using for the cell membrane. The only difference is for the cell membrane, we do have also ability, we do also incorporate the ability for the charged molecules to cross that membrane. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it will be much slower for the charged molecules to get into the membrane. For the lysosomal membrane, only neutral molecules are allowed to cross that membrane. For protein binding, we are incorporating a couple of different models. One is a simple fraction unbound, especially if you are working with a one concentration setup and you don't see much of a saturation. If you added the albumin into the apical or basolateral side, or possibly both, all you need to do is to specify what is the fraction unbound for the program to account for that. If you are working with a compound with very tight binding to the albumin, or maybe trying to account for the concentration dependency, looking at the different doses, different starting concentrations, you may use the saturable model, in which case you need to specify the amount of albumin that was added to a medial, apical, or basolateral side, or both, and specify the binding constant of your compound to the albumin for the program to be able to account for the free concentration as the albumin binding sites are getting saturated. And for that, we are using the standard Hill-Langmuir binding equation. As the last set of processes, again, we are allowing you to account for drag losses to either binding to the plastic, again, how that might be affecting the concentration gradients, how that might be affecting the rate of permeability of your compound, any type of non-specific loss of the compound. Maybe you, from the mass balance, you have figured out that the compound is not stable or is getting lost from the system. You just have not figured out the mechanism yet completely, but want to be able to account for that. Again, you have that kind of process that you can incorporate in your simulation, or possibly looking at the evaporation of the compound from the apical compartment, even though this may be possibly the one of the least important loss mechanisms. So that was a brief overview of the processes that we are incorporating, and as you've seen, it is fairly comprehensive. We are trying to account for all of the processes that so far have been identified as some of the important aspects for drug getting through that cell monolayer. When it comes to the interface or the layout of the program, as you can see, it is very similar to our other programs, especially those of you who are familiar with GastroPlus. We've tried to make it as close to the look and feel of the program as you are used to from GastroPlus. We expect that there would be a lot of common users, especially in terms of translating your in vitro data into in vivo simulations. So to help you get up to speed with this program, we try to keep it as close as possible. Of course, the first tab is going to be your compound information, some of the basic physical-chemical properties that go into the simulations, things like log P, log P or log D, diffusion coefficient, pKa's, all of this, again, you can get also from Admit Predictor. Our Admit Predictor module is linked and available for MembranePlus, just like it is for GastroPlus, and you will have option to have this set up quite easily with the structure import. Enzyme and transporter information, again, for setting up or fitting your KMV max values. Of course, this will not be applicable with the PAMPA assays. This will be applicable only for the cell-based assays. The section describing the passive transport model, on the section previewing or for calculation of the rates of entry and exit from the membranes for neutral as well as for the charged species. The default model, as I was describing, is the structure-based model, which is calculating the entry rates using a model dependent on mainly log P, the ring structures, and the hydrogen bonding capabilities of your compound. And there is an option to switch to the simpler Kubini model, which is dependent only on log P. But again, from what we have seen so far, that model is really best to use only with a congeneric series of compounds, where the hydrogen bonding capabilities or functionalities would not be as important. For pKa and log D, you do have access to the same models as you have in GastroPlus. So again, our state-of-the-art structure-based model for predicting the log D, it is the default model. If you are importing the structure, you will have the same great predictions for the log D versus pH. The next tab, so the first tab is specifying your compound properties. The next tab is the experimental setup, specifying the conditions of your experiment, things like volume and pH of the media, shaking and stirring rate, whether you added albumin to donor or receiver compartment that you would bring up from the form here, specifying any non-specific loss of the compound, and also specifying the sampling protocol. The reason why we are specifying or giving a option to do a detailed specification of sampling protocol is really to be able to account for the changes that the sampling and the way you perform the sampling could affect the concentration or the permeabilities along the experiment. So if you are doing a multi-point measurements and you are making a simple withdrawal of the sample volume, which you might be able to do with large volumes on either apical or basolateral compartment, of course you are changing the volume of the media, which would be affecting your concentration gradient. And if you are decreasing the volume of media in your receiver compartment, you may be actually slowing down the permeability as the experiment goes. You may be accounting for or trying to keep the volumes the same by replacing the sample volume with either blank buffer. This would most likely be done on the receiver compartment, or with the donor solution, again, something that you would most likely do on the donor or starting compartment. Again, this would be affecting your concentration gradients along the experiment, so the software again accounts for those effects. Or even if you try to do keep a perfect sync conditions and you are simply moving the entire insert into a new plate with a fresh blank buffer, again, you have an option to account for that kind of experiment setup. So we have really tried to account for all of the types of setups or conditions that we were able to see in the literature or gathered from discussions with some of our users. The next step, once you have your compound properties, specify the experimental setup, of course it comes down to running the simulation and getting predictions for some of these outcomes. The simulation tab includes outputs for some of the processes that you've incorporated. Of course, we give you output for the permeability and paracellular permeability as well as transcellular permeability contribution to the overall measured permeability. Looking also at the final concentrations of the drug on the receiver donor side as well as inside the membranes, how much of the drug, what is the percent of the compound that was retained in the membrane, so looking at the accumulation of the compound. If you had any loss processes incorporated, how much of the compound during the experiment was lost to different processes, and how much is actually going to be recovered at the end of the experiment, and so on. So we try to give you a overall picture of what is happening to your compound in the system at the end of the experiment. You can, on the graph tab, that's where you can look at the actual concentration profiles. And the basic type of subplots that you can see directly on this graph tab are the concentration time profiles in the donor and the receiver compartment. And also looking at the end amounts. So at the end of the simulation, how was the compound distributed between different, between the apical basolateral compartment and also between different compartments inside the cell. And you can see I was running this simulation on propranolol, showing very high accumulation in the lysosomes towards the end of the simulation. We do have the new plot window as well, where you can plot variety of other profiles. So looking at all of these as a concentration time profiles and so on. And that brings us to looking at simulation modes. Similar again, and I know I keep pointing out these similarities with GastroPlus, but again, it's something that we've tried very hard to keep just to make it more easy for you to start using this program and start utilizing the information that you would learn from MembranePlus and start utilizing it in GastroPlus for your in vivo simulations. So on simulation tab, you can also select different modes of simulation, and again, you can see these are very similar to what you have with GastroPlus. Run simple single simulation, in which case you can look at the details of the drug distribution throughout the experiment, how the concentrations or the drug distribution in different compartments is changing with time. And you have a variety of outputs to plot from. You can look at the concentrations, amounts, free amounts or unbound amounts in your compartments in the basolateral apical media. Again, something that may be important to look at, especially if you added albumin into the media. The batch simulation is something that may be useful for initial screening of the compounds. If you just use the default model, it should be applicable across a variety of structures. You can run the simulation in the batch mode, where again the program will run simulation for every compound in your database and give you an output for the standard or for the most common output concentration that was left on the apical side, basolateral side at the end of the simulation experiment, how the drug was distributed throughout the cells, cell compartments at the end of the experiment, as well as what would be the predicted permeability or the passive permeability of the compound. Sensitivity analysis, very powerful tool and frequently utilized with our other softwares, is expected to be one of the heavily utilized modes with the MembranePlus as well, especially in terms of trying to explore how experimental conditions may be affecting the outcome, how drug properties may be affecting the outcome, how the permeability may be sensitive to different drug properties, and so on. Optimization module, again, is included with MembranePlus, where you can fit either some of the drug properties or fit the experimental conditions. If you are trying to achieve certain outcome, you can figure out what your experimental conditions should be, even though what I personally expect the most of your optimizations would be really targeted towards fitting your transporter parameters, especially for the efflux transporters, fitting the Km Vmax values, especially getting that Km value which is based on the intracellular unbound concentration for more direct translation to in vivo conditions. And you again have option to select from variety of objective function weights and do the optimization against the full concentration profiles. If you did the sequential sampling and have concentrations measured at several different time points, or simply do the optimization against permeability measured in A to B or B to A direction, whatever experiment you ended up doing. And the optimization progress, again, what you are used to from our other softwares. The program does keep you informed about how the optimization is progressing to get you a better feel for whether it's going into the right direction. And I'd like to wrap up this presentation by showing a couple of examples of utilization or examples that we use to validate the software, at least some of the features of the software. One of them is lysosomal trapping. Again, hot topic, especially when it comes to drug distribution in vivo, but maybe also affecting the absorption of the compound, slowing down the appearance of the drug in the systemic circulation, even for the compounds that are assumed to be high permeability compounds. We had some discussions recently on this effect of having class 1 compound with fairly late Tmax, and from our experience for some of these compounds, we were able to account this to the trapping in the enterocytes. So again, this is one of the features that the MembranePlus could help you to answer the question, or the magnitude on the on this effect. For this example, we had the data from literature, from one of our long-time users as well, where they measured propranolol permeability in A to B as well as B to A direction, and measured the propranolol permeability for the compound alone, as well as with administration with baphyllomycin, which affect the lysosomal pH. So we use this example to see whether changes in our lysosomal pH is able to reproduce the effect of the baphyllomycin. And these are the results of the model when propranolol was administered alone with standard lysosomal pH at 4 that was used in the simulation. The experiment was run in A to B direction as well as B to A direction. Here, the red is the apical compartment. It was a donor compartment in this experiment, acceptor compartment in this one. Blue is basolateral compartment, and you can see the curves are nicely, the simulated lines on the curves are nicely matching the experimental data shown as points for each of these systems. And the two additional lines are showing the concentration in the lysosome, in this orange, and the concentration of the drug in the cytosol. So in the cells, and you can see we have a very high accumulation of the drug in the lysosomes. The concentration exceeds the simulated concentration exceeds the cytosolic concentration about 3 orders of magnitude. When the baphyllomycin was added, the concentrations, the observed concentrations, have increased compared to what you would see with the propranolol alone. In this case, the simulations are still using the lysosomal pH 4. You still see that high accumulation in the lysosomes, which is causing that slower appearance on the in the receiver compartment because the drug is getting stuck in the cells too much. But once we adjusted the lysosomal pH to account for the effect of baphyllomycin, you can see a very nice match to the both apical and basolateral compartment, and this is due to a much lower accumulation of propranolol in the lysosomes, and we have maybe 1.5 or 2 orders of magnitude difference between the cytosolic and the lysosomal concentration now. So where you could be using this in more of a predictive manner, I showed here examples of 3 compounds, which I try to pick a clear-cut cases for the base when you compare the propranolol, very high accumulation. The concentration in the lysosomes exceeds the concentration in the cytosol about 3-fold. Moving to a neutral compound, is not going to care about the differences in pHs between the cytosol and lysosome. So the concentrations are perfectly overlaid. You can see the orange curve is right behind the light blue curve or the cyan curve showing the cytosolic concentration. And as we are moving to acidic compound, the lysosomal concentration will actually be below the concentration in the cytosol because we have now more ionization of the compound in the cytosolic pH versus the lysosomal pH. So doing these basic simulations can already give you information, even if we stick with just the bases and looking at bases of different pKa's, it can already start giving you information about the magnitude of the accumulation in lysosomes and see whether this is something that you should worry about when going into the in vivo simulation. The second example is focused on transporter effects, and one of the big aspects would be getting the Km based on the intracellular unbound concentrations. For this example, we used a digoxin as prototypical PGP substrate and used published data that we found in this Troutman paper, where they measured permeabilities in A to B direction, shown in these blue circles, and the B to A direction, the blue triangles, for a variety of donor concentrations, donor digoxin concentrations. This data set showed nice nonlinear dependency in both sets of data, so we were able to use it to fit the Km value, and especially were interested in obtaining the unbound intracellular Km. So we use this data set to fit both Km and Vmax, And before they used the fitted KM to predict the concentration time profiles from another experiment. This was an experiment that we had measured, and you can see here concentration time profiles in both donor and acceptor compartments for experiments, for 5 experiments with concentrations ranging from 5 to 300 micromolar. All of these were done in A to B direction, and using the KM as obtained by fitting to the Troutman data and adjusting Vmax to account for possible differences in PGP expression levels. Since these measurements were done in different experiment and different system than the data that we use to fit the KM and Vmax values, it is possible that the PGP expression levels would be different and the Vmax would need to be adjusted. But the KM was used exactly as fitted to the previous data set, and as you can see, it was able to nicely reproduce the both donor as well as acceptor concentrations for all of these 5 different doses of digoxin. And it also nicely reproduced the nonlinear dose dependency of the measured apparent permeability as shown in this plot down here. So as the apparent permeability, the apparent measured permeability was increasing as the PGP was getting saturated with increasing dose. So these were just 2 examples showcasing at least some of the capabilities of the program. We selected 2 of the examples focusing on lysosomal trapping and the transporter effect, especially obtaining the efflux transporter parameters, which are kind of hot topics in the community these days. But of course, the program has a lot more capabilities. To give the credit where the credit is due, this work was done by mainly simulation technologies team, and especially 2 of our brilliant scientists, Jim Mullin and Kay Zito, who put a lot of work into development of this software over the past 2 or 3 years, and managed to bring it to the market. Mike Bolger, many of you know, probably all of you know, our chief scientist, who is driving scientific development of many of our products. Also need to thank Marvin Waldman, member of one of our cheminformatics teams, who helped us a lot with trying to parameterize and fine-tune the passive diffusion model through the membranes. And we do get also help and support from our remaining teams, computational technologies, chemoinformatics teams, as well as the consulting studies teams. That concludes the presentation, and I'm ready to answer any questions that might have come up. Thank you.
The first question is, how well could we use MembranePlus to check the permeability of an active drug which is encapsulated in a nano delivery system?
That may be a little bit more difficult. The system that we have, MembranePlus, is right now targeted really looking at the permeability of the API alone. So if the nanoparticles, if you are looking at the diffusion of the nanoparticles themselves, that part we are not accounting for. So the question is whether your system, your delivery system, is looking at absorption or the permeability of the whole nanoparticles, or whether the drug is being released from the nanoparticles and then permeates, in which case the overall permeability that you may be observing would be a combination of the rate of release from your nanoparticles versus the permeability of the API alone. So if that's the case, you could use MembranePlus to perhaps do the prediction for what would be the permeability part for the API alone, and then they calculate what may be the rate of release from the nanoparticles.
Thank you, Viera. Another question, and I think you might have addressed the first part of this on slide number 40, but for lysosomal trapping, why are only neutral molecules allowed to cross in that case?
That is a good question. When we were doing these experiments or doing these simulations, we found that the high concentration gradient, and Jim may correct me if I'm wrong, that I believe that was the case why we limited it only to the neutral molecules. We are still checking on what is the actual mechanism for it, whether the membrane have slightly different composition that makes the charged molecules less permeable than a cellular membrane, but from what we have observed was that the high concentration gradient of the charged molecule inside the lysosomes would actually push those out quite a bit more, and we were not able to achieve as high lysosomal trapping effect as was observed.
Thank you, Viera. Second part to that question is, what are the references, or do you have any references for the physiological parameters, for example, the number of lysosomes, the volumes, etc.?
I'm pretty sure we had that information came based on literature references. I don't have them on the top of my head. I'm not sure if Jim has, or if we would enable Kay, who I think is one of our attendees. I'm pretty sure that it came from the literature, but I just don't recall the exact articles where it came from.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how well could MembranePlus be applied to simulate a skin membrane model?
Right now, not very well. It is right at the moment. I'm not sure if the slides are actually going to move to the earlier slides where we had the picture with the mechanisms, and as you can or recall from the earlier slides, the mechanisms are really targeted for what is happening going through a single monolayer. So going through the slab of skin where you have several different cell layer tissues, that would require some expansion of the model. Right now it was really focused looking at the monolayer systems. There could be perhaps some workarounds that we could come up with certain parameter settings to approximate the permeability through the tissue slice, but it's not, at the moment, it wasn't really targeted towards that kind of simulation.
Thank you, Viera. Question, when apical pH is changed, let's say the range is from pH 5 to 7.4, is transporter affinity, for example, Km and Vmax, also adjusted?
No, not at the moment. We have seen some reports where transporters are showing, or we know that some transporters are showing different activity at different pHs. Right now we did not have that kind of system information. It is at the moment more generic. So the transporters you would be adding to the software and so on. Hopefully we'll get to that extension so that the transporters which are pH sensitive, we would be making that adjustment, but it's not incorporated in this first version yet.
Okay, thank you. Another question in slide 40, when we compare the three types of drugs, acidic, neutral, and basic, the lysosomal concentration simulations change as hypothesized, but there is no visible change in the drug concentrations in the cytosol, apical, and basolateral compartments. How could that be explained by mass balance, and was the initial concentration the same for all three drugs?
Let me go back there. The initial concentrations, I'll have to double check if they were the same. Let me see if I can look at the MembranePlus. So for propranolol, 1 micromolar, ibuprofen, yeah, the initial concentrations were the same, and the apical and basolateral concentrations for each of those are matching well. So the rate of permeation was changing. How quickly the drug was coming or the system was coming close to the equilibrium was changing. But there are the other thing you need to keep in mind, I showed those on a log scale, so on a regular scale you would see slight differences at least, especially in the basolateral compartment. But the concentrations, the initial concentrations in the experiment were the same.
Okay, thank you, Viera. Another question, how can you predict protein binding in a cell? Was it using some experimental data?
That is a good question. Right now we are not accounting for protein binding inside the cells. At the moment we've accounted for the processes, or we assume that the partitioning into the membranes would be the more dominant process. So the sequestration in the membranes would be the more dominant process. One of the aspects is how to predict or how to account for possible non-specific binding inside the cells. So we are still exploring that, and if that turns out to be a really dominant or important aspect, we would be adding that in the future. For now, we looked more at the possible binding in the apical or basolateral compartment, which would be, even in terms of tissue distribution, the albumin would be more in extracellular space, and for intracellular processes, the lysosomal trapping and the sequestration in membrane seem to be the more important aspect. But definitely, if we find more information and more data accounting for possible non-specific binding to protein inside the cells, we would be expanding this model.
Thank you, Viera. A question, how well can this program be used to predict the permeability with DDI or co-administration of two drugs, which might compete for uptake transporters, or one being an inhibitor for efflux transporters?
So that's something that I mentioned that one of the early slides. Right now it's not fitted for DDI type simulations. That would be one of the probably one of the first expansions for the model, accounting for the interactions and be able to fit the Ki values or competition. But right now it is a single molecule type simulation.
Thank you, Viera. Another question, how is membrane permeability of charged molecules estimated? And why is this permeability of charged molecules only accounted for in the plasma membrane, but not in the lysosomal membrane?
I think the lysosomal membrane, why we have the difference, I already explained that it came based on the observation from these experiments, and we are still trying to find a mechanistic explanation behind that. Right now, the working hypothesis is that perhaps the membrane composition may be different for the lysosomal membrane versus the cell membrane. How we are accounting for the diffusion of the charged species through the cell membrane, the same way as we have models to account for log D or differences in partitioning into the membranes for the neutral and charged species. We would be using the same equations to account for charged species as well. So it's based on similar theories, looking at log D versus log P, the same type of model we are using also for the entry rates for neutral versus charged species.
Thank you, Viera. Another question, does MembranePlus allow us to predict the effect of a permeation enhancer or combination of enhancers?
Not at the moment. We have not incorporated the effects of the permeation enhancers. It is definitely a good question, and if you have any experience, whoever posted that question, we'd be happy to talk to you more in the details to see if we can incorporate those effects into the model.
Thank you, Viera. Another question. Some basic drugs are phospholipid bound rather than lysosomally trapped. Can we account for such cases?
Phospholipid binding, right now, that would be accounted within that rates of getting in and out of the membranes. So being trapped in the membranes, the calibration set that we used to account or for our model to account for the rates of getting in and out of the membrane included a variety of compounds, including basic compounds, but I would have to go back and see if it included compounds that have the significant binding to acidic phospholipids rather than partitioning into the membrane. But that may be one of the aspects why we had to incorporate the some of the additional parameters into the model other than just the log P or log D.
Thank you, Viera. Another question, in your first example with propranolol, you dealt with lysosomal trapping without any involvement of transporters because this compound is not a ligand of transporters. In the second example, you dealt with PGP efflux without taking care of lysosomal trapping. How would you deal with a compound taking into account both mechanisms, lysosomal trapping and transporter involvement?
Well, you can incorporate both into the system. The lysosomal trapping, for that one, we really did not fit any additional parameters. That was really based on the compound properties. So the lysosomal aspect, or the process of drug actually getting into lysosomes, was turned on also in the second case for the digoxin. I just didn't show that kind of analysis because it wasn't an important aspect. But you can include all of these processes in the model, and the lysosomal trapping being mainly the aspect of the pH differences would be accounted for automatically by the drug properties, so you would still fit only the transporter parameters.
Thank you, Viera. Another question. Does MembranePlus also take into account uptake transporters? Yes,
of course. You can account for uptake or efflux transporters on either apical or basolateral membrane. Again, what we've provided was a tool where you can incorporate all of these processes, and when it comes to transporters, it's just a matter of what kind of system you are using and what compound you are working with, which transporters may be effective. You can incorporate any transporters in the system.
Thank you, Viera. Another question. We sometimes observe non-unity efflux ratios for passively fluxing compounds like mannitol, presumably due to some experimental artifact. Does MembranePlus ever show a similar trend?
One of the aspects, actually, I'm not sure if we've explored this in the detail. Maybe Kay or Jim would have to chime in on this one if we had enough data to actually explore that kind of differences. But one of the aspects that I'm not sure if my slides are moving, if you guys can see anything where I'm trying to go to here.
No, it's still frozen.
Okay, so we had one slide where I was showing the paracellular permeability, and you would see that we actually account for different apical versus basolateral porosity, just because of the shape of the pores, and the openings are a little bit bigger on one side than the other. So that might account for this specific aspect of the mannitol. But I'm not sure if we have looked, if we had the data to look at it in any close detail to see how it's accounting for that kind of difference.
Thank you, Viera. Another question is, MembranePlus also account for membrane metabolism on the apical side as a concentration loss process?
You mean metabolism inside of the membranes? We are definitely able to account for metabolism inside the cell. So once the drug, and we are accounting for the, we are using the intracellular concentration inside the cells to account for the metabolism. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
And then there seems like there's a clarifying comment, not inside the cells, but on the membrane, metabolism by the membrane binding enzyme.
No, we have not incorporated that kind of process, which would be taking into account the concentration in the membrane to account for. No, we have not dealt with that process yet.
Okay. I believe that is the last of a very long list of questions that came in. Oh, no, actually it looks like another question. With CACO2 cells, how do you account for the low expression of CYP3A4A5?
We actually don't have built-in expression levels just because this can change from one system to another. So at the moment, that low expression would be sort of lumped within your Vmax value. If the expression is very low, you would not even have to worry about losing the compound significantly due to metabolism. But because there are, well, one aspect is the actual expression levels. The quantitative information we were not able to find for individual enzymes or transporters, but those will be also, again, highly dependent on the type of system that you are using and so on. So that may need to be more of a user type specification.
And actually, I do see our friend Greg Nip with his hand raised, and what I'm going to do is unmute him because he's writing in some comments. It might be easier for him to express verbally some of his thoughts.
My mic is terrible. Sorry.
That's okay.
Just quickly, the thing that I would wonder about too is if you have a low expression of CYP3A4, 3A5, which has been shown in a number of studies, then it may also influence PGP function as well as other efflux proteins involved in conjugates. And I also know that a lot of times you try to use butyrate to stimulate it. So making these assumptions, is there, are you really, I guess I'm really concerned, how do you account for some of these things? Because the butyrate will also change the cell function significantly.
So, and that comes down to the comment that I made earlier. A lot of these system parameters, we can provide some defaults, but because your culture conditions, your addition or not addition of certain components will be heavily affecting some of these aspects. So we can provide some basic default values, but a lot of this physiological information would be dependent on the user. Perhaps as we are collecting more information, we may be able to expand the set of physiological parameters and be able to account for this, or provide more built-in system descriptions accounting for some of these processes. But right now, because it's going to be so dependent on lab-to-lab variability, some of these are going to be very dependent on user specifications.
Very true.
So one other question just snuck in. I might have missed a few slides, but I was wondering, how do you calculate Km and Vmax of efflux transporters if cell lines are not polarized based on unbound intracellular concentration?
Not sure if I understand the question very well. You are able to, if the cell lines are not polarized, you would have the same type of expression level, or you would not have the differential expression level on the apical versus basolateral membrane, and you could then just include that transport on both membranes. Not sure if I understand the question well.
Let's see. Yes. Yeah, it seems like it might have been answered to a satisfactory level. I don't see any follow-up comment or question. Yes, did get a response back saying thank you.
All right.
Another question just came in. Might have to ask for some clarification, but can we use this for silver nanoparticles?
No, not really. We have not really, again, the focus was mainly looking at what would be happening to the small molecules, to the APIs. So looking at any particle effects, different types of processes, different type of properties would be important aspects, and we have not looked into the particles themselves. There is still a lot of issues that we are trying to solve with the APIs alone. So other than reparametrizing or trying to find some workarounds and changing some of the parameters, it's not really as a out-of-box solution. It's not really targeted towards nanoparticle type absorption.
Thank you, Viera. And I don't see any further questions. So once again, I really want to thank Viera for the very nice presentation and the excellent answers to the variety of questions that came in. That's going to conclude today's webinar. If you missed any part of today's presentation, we will make the presentation slides available, and we will re-record the last bit of the discussion so that the playback will be available at our website, www.simulations-plus.com. Finally, we are happy to provide an evaluation license to MembranePlus or any of our software to allow you to test the programs with available data and identify firsthand how it can assist with your research activities. Please visit our website, www.simulations-plus.com, to fill out the simple request form. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.